I pulled up to my brother's house with a casserole dish balanced on my lap and the windows down. Because it was the kind of warm Tuesday evening that makes you feel like everything in your life is exactly where it's supposed to be. I had no reason to think otherwise. Mom had called me that morning to say she was having one of her good days. She'd eaten a full breakfast, recognized the neighbor's dog by name, recognized me when I called, and I remember hanging up the phone and just standing in my kitchen for a second, smiling at nothing. Those good days had gotten rarer. You learn to hold them like something fragile. I parked in the driveway behind my brother's truck, grabbed the dish, and knocked twice before walking in the way I always did. And that's when my sister-in-law looked up from the couch, and her face did something I still can't fully describe. It wasn't surprise, exactly. It was more like someone who'd been caught, a flash of something she swallowed quickly, and then her expression rearranged itself into something almost normal. "Oh," she said. "You're here. Not hey, come in. Not the food smells amazing. Just you're here." Like I was the one who had shown up wrong. My brother came out of the kitchen and I saw it again, that half second of something before he smiled. He told me Mom was resting. He said maybe we should sit down, and I remember thinking that was strange because I'd never needed to be invited to sit down in that house before. They told me they'd made a decision about Mom's care. Not we're thinking about, or we wanted to ask you. A decision. The memory care facility over in Raleigh, the one I'd actually researched and recommended 14 months ago, had an opening, and they had already put down the deposit. They'd already signed the paperwork. They'd already handled it. "We knew you were busy with work," my sister-in-law said. "We didn't want to stress you out." I looked at my brother and he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Here's what they didn't mention that evening. The facility costs $9,800 a month. Here's what else they didn't mention. Mom's estate would be covering it. Here's what they really didn't mention. My brother had been named sole financial power of attorney over Mom's accounts 4 months earlier and I had not been told. I found that out 3 days later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I drove home that night with the casserole still in the dish because nobody had touched it. I put it in the refrigerator and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a while. I wasn't crying. I was doing that thing where you're trying to figure out if you're overreacting, cataloging every detail like a lawyer making a case to yourself. Maybe they were just trying to help. Maybe they knew I'd been overwhelmed since the audit at work. Maybe this is actually fine. But the look on my sister-in-law's face kept coming back to me. That split second before she rearranged herself. I called my mom's primary care doctor the next morning, Dr. Tet Okafor, who'd been treating her for almost 6 years and knew our family, just to ask about the transition, whether Mom had been told, how she was processing it. Dr. Okafor paused in a way that made my stomach drop, and then said, gently, that she hadn't actually been consulted about the facility placement. That the referral hadn't come through her office. That she'd be reaching out to my brother. That was the first thread I pulled. The second came 2 days later when I went to visit Mom at the house. She hadn't moved yet. The facility date was still 3 weeks out, and I found her at the kitchen table going through a folder of papers. Old papers. She handed me one and said, "Honey, I've been trying to remember signing this." It was a document transferring power of attorney to my brother. Dated 8 months ago. My mother's signature at the bottom. My mom, who on her best days could remember the neighbor's dog's name. I took a picture of it with my phone and didn't say anything to her about it. I just sat with her for 2 hours and helped her finish a jigsaw puzzle of the Smoky Mountains that had been on the table for a week. When I left, I hugged her for a long time. That night I called an elder law attorney. Her name was Vivienne Torres, and she had the kind of calm, measured voice that you want in someone when you're sitting across a desk from them trying not to fall apart. I laid out everything I knew, which at that point wasn't much. The POA document, the facility decision I hadn't been included in, my mother's cognitive state, the doctor who hadn't been consulted. Vivienne listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "The date on that POA is important. Do you know what your mother's documented cognitive status was 8 months ago?" I did know. I had years of appointment summaries saved in my email because I'd been the one taking Mom to most of her appointments. 8 months ago, Dr. Okafor had noted moderate cognitive impairment, consistent decline, and had specifically documented that Mom's capacity for complex financial decision-making was significantly diminished. Vivienne said, "Then we have a problem. Or rather, your brother does." She also asked me something I hadn't thought to ask myself. Had I looked at whether I was still listed in Mom's original will? I had a copy. I went home and found it. My brother and I were named equally. 50-50 on the house, the accounts, everything. Drawn up 7 years ago by a family attorney named Howard Ketley, who had since retired. What I did not have was any documentation of a more recent will. What I also did not have was any information about where Mom's financial accounts actually stood. I had no access. I hadn't needed access because it had never occurred to me that I should need it. That week I started a spreadsheet. I put everything I knew at the top and everything I didn't know underneath. The didn't know column was significantly longer. My brother texted me on a Thursday. Just, hey, wanted to check in. You doing okay? You seemed off the other night? I stared at that text for a long time. I typed back, I'm fine. Can we talk this weekend? He said sure and then went quiet. Saturday morning he called instead of coming over. He sounded careful. Rehearsed. He said he knew I was probably feeling left out of the decision about Mom, and he understood that, and he was sorry they hadn't looped me in sooner. But it had all moved quickly and they'd just been trying to do what was best for her. He said my sister-in-law had done a lot of research on the facility. He said it had excellent ratings. I let him talk. I asked a few questions. When had he first started looking at facilities? Who had he spoken to? Had Mom been part of any of the conversations? He answered everything smoothly, and I kept thinking about the word rehearsed and what that meant. Before we hung up, I said, hey, I was looking through some old papers and I found Mom's POA. I didn't realize you'd been named. When did that happen? A beat, maybe 2. She asked me to handle it, he said. She felt like it made more sense logistically since I'm closer to her. I said. Do you know who drafted it? I didn't recognize the notary. He said he thought it was some office over in Durham. He'd have to look it up. He never looked it up. Vivienne referred me to a forensic document examiner, a woman named Dr. Elaine Chu at a firm in Charlotte, and Dr. Chu had that POA document evaluated within 10 days. Her finding, the signature did not exhibit the characteristic pressure patterns or pen lift consistency of my mother's known signatures from earlier documents. In her professional opinion, the signature had been traced or closely mimicked from an existing sample. I sat in Vivienne's office when she told me and I heard myself make a sound that wasn't quite a word. I know, Vivienne said. Take a breath. Here's the thing about finding out that someone you've known your whole life, someone you shared a childhood with, someone you thought you knew. Here's the thing about finding out they may have forged your mother's signature on a legal document to seize control of her finances while she was cognitively impaired. There's no clean emotion that covers it. It's not just anger, and it's not just grief, and it's not just disbelief. It's all of them at once, layered on top of each other. And underneath all of it is this hollow place where your understanding of your family used to be. I went home and I made a list of every financial institution I knew my mother had accounts with. Vivienne had already begun the process of filing a formal challenge to the POA on grounds of lack of capacity, which would trigger a review. In the meantime, I requested a copy of Mom's most recent bank statements directly from her bank. I was still listed as an authorized contact on her primary checking account, something my brother apparently hadn't thought to remove. And what I found when those statements arrived made me sit down on my kitchen floor. Over the previous 11 months, $147,000 had been transferred out of my mother's savings account in increments, never more than $9,500 at a time, a number I later learned was deliberately chosen to stay below the federal reporting threshold of $10,000. The transfers went to an account I didn't recognize. When I cross-referenced the account number with what little information I could gather, it traced back to a business LLC registered in my brother's name. A business I had never heard of. A business that, according to North Carolina state records, had been registered 6 months after the POA was signed. Vivienne said the word structuring. She said it was a federal offense. She said we needed to contact the authorities. I want to be honest about something. I did not want to do that. I know that probably sounds strange given everything I've just told you, but I need you to understand that calling the authorities on your own brother is not a decision you make lightly or cleanly. I sat with it for 4 days. I talked to a therapist. I went back to see my mom, sat with her in the afternoon light while she told me about a dream she'd had about my father, who's been gone for 9 years, and I watched her face while she talked. Peaceful, unguarded, trusting, and I thought about the fact that someone had looked at her in that state and seen an opportunity. That was what made it clear. I called the Adult Protective Services Unit in our county and gave them everything. Vivienne filed simultaneously with the North Carolina State Bar to flag the notary on the document. Within a week, APS had opened a formal investigation. Within 3 weeks, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had been brought in because of the structuring pattern in the bank transfers. My brother did not know any of this was happening. Neither did my sister-in-law. The thing about a financial investigation is that it moves in ways you don't see until suddenly you can see all of it at once. What came out over the following 2 months was this. The LLC my brother had created had received not just the transfers from my mother's savings, but also funds from a second account I hadn't known existed. A joint account my mother and father had set up together years ago, which my brother had quietly shifted ownership of using the fraudulent POA. Beyond that, the investigators found that my sister-in-law, who worked as an office manager at a financial advisory firm, had been using her position there to access client account information and had been involved in 2 separate instances of unauthorized fund transfers at the firm. Her crimes were entirely separate from my brother's but had apparently been happening in parallel, and investigators described their situation as, and I remember this phrasing exactly, a household with a pattern of financial opportunism. Total amount taken from my mother, $201,000 across all accounts. When the FBI executed the search warrant on their house, my brother called me. I didn't answer. He called 4 more times that day. I didn't answer any of them. What I did do was drive to the memory care facility. Mom had been moved 2 weeks earlier, and the placement itself was legitimate and actually good, which was the one thing in this entire situation that didn't require untangling, and I sat with her in the garden and helped her water her tomato plants, which she'd asked the staff to let her keep in a little raised bed by the window. She asked me if everything was okay. I told her that some things were being sorted out and that she didn't need to worry about any of it. "You've always handled things," she said, and patted my hand. I held it together until I got to the parking lot. The legal process took 14 months from start to sentencing, which everyone told me was actually fast. My brother pleaded guilty to elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and structuring, federal charges, and received 4 years in federal prison, plus 5 years probation and full restitution of $211,000. My sister-in-law, charged separately for her firm-related crimes, received 18 months and was permanently barred from working in financial services. The original will, the real one, the one I'd had a copy of all along, was upheld. The fraudulent POA was voided. Mom's remaining accounts were placed under a court-appointed independent fiduciary while the restitution process worked through the courts, and I was added as a court-authorized oversight contact, not control. I didn't want control. I wanted transparency, and that's what I asked for. The $9,800 a month facility, it turned out, had not been chosen because it was the best fit for Mom. It had been chosen because it was the most expensive option, and my brother had intended for the estate to pay it while the excess from Mom's liquidated accounts quietly moved into his LLC. Once investigators understood the full picture, the court authorized a facility review, and Mom was transitioned to a different memory care center. Closer to me, better staff ratio, a legitimately excellent dementia care program, at $5,400 a month. She still has her tomato plants. She asked about them immediately when we toured the new place, and the director, without missing a beat, said of course. I've thought a lot about when it started. Whether there was a moment I should have seen, a tell I missed, something that would have let me pull that thread sooner. I've had conversations with the APS investigators and with Vivienne and with the therapist I still see every other week, and the answer they all give me, in different ways, is the same. You can't protect against someone whose strategy depends on your trust. That's the whole mechanism. The exploitation works precisely because you believe in the person doing it. What I have now is a checklist I've shared with every friend who has aging parents. Get a copy of all estate documents, will, POA, beneficiary designations, and make sure you know where they are and what they say. If a POA is created while a parent is experiencing cognitive decline, consult an elder law attorney immediately about the capacity requirements in your state. Set up authorized contact status at your parents' financial institutions so that you can receive statements even if you're not the primary account holder. Document everything. Dates, conversations, phone calls. If something feels wrong, it probably is, and you don't need to have all the evidence before you talk to an attorney. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm someone who went to her brother's house with a casserole on a Tuesday evening and walked into something I couldn't have prepared for. But I got through it. And my mom is in a garden right now, somewhere between sleep and awake with her hands in the dirt, which is exactly where she's happiest. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the verdict, not the sentencing, not the number at the bottom of the restitution order. Just her in the garden, telling me I've always handled things. I'm going to keep handling things. For her, for as long as she needs me to. I've been thinking lately about what it actually takes for someone to do what my brother did. Not the mechanics of it, the forged signature, the LLC. The transfer's just under $10,000 so nothing would flag, but the internal process. The moment where a person looks at their own mother, sitting at her kitchen table struggling to finish a puzzle, and decides that's an opportunity rather than a heartbreak. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure I want one. What I do know is this: the choices we make when no one is watching are the ones that define us most completely. My brother made his choices quietly, carefully over the course of almost a year. He was methodical about it. He thought he'd covered everything, and for a while, he had. Because the system he was exploiting was built on trust. My trust. My mother's trust. The trust of every institution that took documents at face value, because most people don't forge their mother's signature. That's the part that sat with me hardest during those 14 months of legal process. Not the anger, which came and went. Not the grief, which was steadier and slower. It was the recognition that I had made it easier for him by being the kind of person who assumes the best. I had never checked the POA because it hadn't occurred to me to check. I had never monitored Mom's accounts because I believed we were on the same team. I'm not going to tell you that was naive or foolish. I still think trusting your family is the right starting position. What I learned, what this entire experience carved into me, is that trust without verification is a gift you give someone, and not everyone deserves to keep it. The moment something doesn't add up, the moment a face rearranges itself a half second too slowly, that instinct that flickers and says something is wrong, that instinct is worth more than the discomfort of acting on it. I acted on it. I pulled the thread. I sat across a desk from Vivian and said everything out loud even when it felt disloyal to say it, and that act of choosing clarity over comfort is what made every subsequent thing possible. The forensic review. The investigation. The restitution. My mom's garden at the new facility. None of that happens if I go home that Tuesday night and talk myself out of what I felt in my body the moment I walked through that door. Here's what I want to leave you with. Intelligence without courage is just a way of understanding your own helplessness. Knowing something is wrong and doing nothing about it, for the sake of peace, for the sake of keeping the family together, for the sake of not being the difficult one, that's not wisdom. That's just a more elaborate way of giving up. My mother told me I've always handled things. I don't know if that's true, but I know that when it mattered most, I handled this one. Not perfectly, not without fear, but completely. That's enough.